My name is Adam. This is my friend
Jeff.
Jeff. We are program managers in the Azure Active Directory product group. I work on our identity admin experiences, UI experiences, do things with apps, do things with password reset. And Jeff?
I work on the Microsoft Graph API. I also work on our consent and permissions model.
Our dirty secret is that we partner kind of together on what we call a virtual team, where we look at consent improvements that we can make and experiences that we can improve from both of the perspectives of the API and the admin experiences. So we're going to give you a really cool talk which explains conceptually what application consent is, what permissions are, how they work, how we can kind of draw some analogies to what you guys use every single day. We're going to show you some really cool demos along the way, and then we'll give you some time to ask us some questions. Sound cool? All right. So as an agenda, the first thing is that we're going to introduce to you some terminology, and we're also going to sort of level set in terms of what consent and permissions are, because it turns out it's a little confusing, and we want to deconfusify it. And then we're going to actually go into some runtime configurations so you understand how you can set this up in your system. We're going to then finish off with what it means as an administrator to actually manage this stuff. And so we hope that at the end of it, you kind of get a good sense of what it is and how to use it in your organizations. So what is application consent? Before explaining anything, if I said application consent, how many of you guys would be confused? Raise your hands. Okay, perfect. So it's actually pretty simple conceptually. We use it every single day. How many of you guys have cell phones? Everyone should raise their hand. How many of you guys have installed an app on your phones? Yeah? Okay. When you use an app, if you use an Android, for example, you might open the application. It might not ask for any permissions, but let's say it uses your camera, right? You open that guy, it says, hey, I got to use your camera. Do you want to allow this? Disallow this. That is application consent, conceptually. You are granting a permission to do a thing. Turns out that we do that at Microsoft. We have a wonderful developer platform. As a developer or as an administrator, you use it every single day if you use Office 365, et cetera. And the idea is that as a developer, for example, you might want to build stuff against our APIs to do cool stuff with organizational data that big organizations use, right? You might want to grab like somebody's Exchange calendar or something like that, build some cool app. As an administrator, you have organizational data that your users are using, and you might want to control the experience that they have when they actually grant access to that data. So the concept is that organizational data that you want to leverage as a developer or as an administrator is accessed through APIs, right? And those APIs expose permissions. An example of a permission would be, I want to read Adam's mailbox, or I want to read all mailboxes for all of Contoso Corp, right? Very different levels of permission there, and we'll get into that in a second. Applications that a developer might create want access to that data to do cool stuff, right? And they request access at those different levels that I just described. So they might request access at a very high level, scary level, or at a very scoped level. And those permissions, as a result, can be granted through two different kind of workflows. They can either be granted by an administrator or an end user. So you as an end user of your phone grants permissions to the camera, right? But in a big organization, an administrator can also say, hey, I trust this application and I want it to be able to do stuff for everyone. And that idea of granting permissions is called application consent. You are consenting to the application to do a thing. Make sense? All right, so how many of you are now confused when I say application consent, what that means? All right, wonderful. Okay, and it turns out those permissions are managed over time by both the end user, the administrator, and developer. So this means that you can like revoke, permissions, just like you can like nuke an app from your phone, or like say like, I don't want you to use the camera anymore. You can do the same thing with our stuff. So here's a cool picture. And I understand it might be a little bit hard to read. I apologize about that. But I'm going to walk you through just like consent lifecycle in an organization, and then I'm going to hand it over to my buddy over here who will talk more about developer configuration, and we'll end with that manageability bit. All right, step one, developer. How many guys are developers? Sweet. All right. first step is you got to register an application with us that requests permissions to stuff. So we're going to use an example called the Bad Sharing Portal. This is a terrible app. None of you amazing developers would actually ever build this application because this is like a bad B2B implementation, business-to-business implementation. And what this application does is it accesses any user's SharePoint information in a, let's say, Contoso, anyone's. That's what it's requesting. And then it's going to take some random file from there, attach it in an email, and it will send that file as the signed-in user to someone. So it's a way for me to leak all of your corporate information. That's why it's called the Bad Sharing Portal. So a developer registers this cool new Bad Sharing Portal application. In order to enable the things that I just described, reading any user's SharePoint and sending emails assigned in user, it needs to request 2 permissions through Microsoft Graph. The first is it needs to request the ability to read all items in all site collections from SharePoint online. Okay? This is an example of a very, very permissive thing. It's everything, right? So this is an example of something where an administrator must consent, right? Makes sense. Like an administrator is like, you're going to read everything about all my users in my SharePoint? Like, yeah, I'm going to have to make sure that that's a legit thing. Okay? That's called an application level permission. How many of you guys know the difference between application and delegated permissions in Azure Active Directory? Raise your hands. Okay, so to explain the difference, an application permission is something that the application is doing as itself. So the application is reading items as itself. So it's like the app has that permission itself. The other example of a permission type is what's called a delegated permission. And this is the example of something like sending mail as Adam, right? Because it's doing something on my behalf. It's actually executing as me. And because it's executing as me, I'm allowed to consent to it as an end user. But it turns out because like the most permissive thing wins, right? So in this case, even though it's requesting 2 of these levels of permission, I can't user consent to this app. Like Adam cannot do that. I have to have an administrator do this for me because it's requesting one of these hardcore things. Okay? So what happens if I do not perform administrator consent and I try and access Bad Sharing Portal as an end user? I'm going to sign in and it's going to fail. And it's going to fail with an AAD STS error. You might have seen these. You might have got help desk tickets as a result of these. This is because it's requesting an application level permission that an admin must consent to first, and that consent has not been granted. So step 4 is the administrator has to actually go consent to that thing before it can be used. They can do it in many different ways. They can either sign into the application itself, click a button, grant it for all users in the organization. They can actually do so through our administrative portal by clicking a giant grant permissions button. I'll show you that later. They can also pass some URL parameters. In any case, there's many different ways of accomplishing this. Once administrator consent is performed, the end user comes back, can happily sign in, and then over time, the administrator can actually manage those permissions, revoke them, see them, get audit information about it, all sorts of cool stuff. So that is the summary of how consent works and our intro, and I'm going to hand it over to my friend here who will go to the next level.
Thank you. All right, so before we talk about how a developer goes and gets their app configured, which is an important step even if you're not a developer, because what the developer does and what they set up directly affects the experience for end users and how everything shows up to an admin. But before we get into that, I just want to reiterate something Adam touched on briefly, which is the difference between delegated permissions and application permissions. So as he said, delegated permissions, also known as user permissions, are what an app uses when it gets access on behalf of users. So this is the app has a user that signs into the app, and the app is making calls on that user's behalf. This is really important because the effective permissions that an application has in this scenario are the intersection of the permissions that the user has and that the application has been consented to have. So what this means is if an end user who's not an admin logs into an application that's been granted, say, the ability to read and write all users in a directory, in a AAD tenant, because that non-admin user can't delete users on their own, the application can't delete users on behalf of that end user. So it's not There's no elevation of privilege possible here when delegated permissions are in place. So in other words, delegated permissions are not as scary as they may sound. If an app wants the permissions to say manage groups, it's only going to be able to manage groups that the end user who's using that app was able to manage in the first place. We also have application permissions. This is when an app gets access as a service or as itself. This is otherwise known as S2S or daemons, the daemon scenario. This is when an app's running in the background. It might be synchronizing things offline. It might be running some background task. And in this case, it actually needs a high level of privilege. It needs application permissions so it can act as itself and not on behalf of any logged in user, because there will be no logged in user. In this case, these are high privilege permissions. The app is not constrained to the privilege of any individual user, but for this reason, only an administrator can consent to an app having these sort of permissions. And everything we talk about here is talking about the AAD v1 endpoint. Just know that the AAD v2 endpoint has some additional features and benefits when it comes to consent, like dynamic and incremental consent, and a few other things. We won't dwell on this. We only have a short amount of time. But we're talking about v1 here because that's what's more prevalent in the wild today. But just be aware that v2 exists. And there are some differences, and you can grill us about those after the presentation.
Hey, Jeff, can I ask a question?
Yes.
What is incremental consent?
Great question. Incremental consent, so in the V1 model, applications are required to ask for all the permissions they may ever need up front. In V2, they can ask for some permissions up front and more later as necessary. This is super useful in cases where you have apps that have optional features that require more permissive permissions. So basically, if you have a company portal, let's say, that normally just shows a user what's on their calendar for the day and what plans they have queued up or what tasks they have queued up in Planner, but optionally allows them to upload files or send emails directly from the portal. It could ask for the permission to upload those files or send mail on behalf of the user later, only when necessary, and not ask for it up front for every user. So it's a way to keep to this, this promise of least privilege and this best practice that we tell developers to abide by of always using least privilege. So basically, that's a best practice for developers is ask for the permissions you need, nothing more, nothing less, when you need them. And incremental consent helps that. So let me show you what it looks like to get this set up as a developer. We're not going to go into code, but this is just more about the app registration portion. So again, this is a V1 app, so I'm going to declare all the permissions I need up front. Oops. So I'm in the Azure portal here in the AAD blade. And I'm going to create a new application registration, and we're going to call it company portal, and it's a web app, and it lives at contoso.com, of course. And we'll go create it. All right, now let's set it up to access some APIs. So we're going to remove this because I'm a good developer and I know that I should be using Microsoft Graph for all of my API needs. All right, so here you see there's all these application permissions that require admin consent. And then we have a bunch of delegated permissions that many of which don't require admin consent, but some do. Even for delegated permissions, we consider some things high privilege, and we require an admin to consent to them. So let's just, let's see. This is my just basic company portal that's going to sign users in and read their profiles and read the tasks they have for the day. So we'll choose these permissions. All right, so I've saved that. And then now we can see what a consent prompt actually looks like for this app. So I've got my app ID here, and I saved the URL, so you don't have to watch me manually type in all these query strings. All right. So I'm logged in with a non-admin user over here. It's a different person. and I sign in, and the company portal is requesting permission to sign me in and read my profile and read my tasks and tasks that are shared with me. If I'm an admin, I could also consent to this app. So that was a regular user, and that's the same prompt an admin would see by default. But if the app asked for admin consent, or if an admin proactively wanted to consent to that app on behalf of the entire organization, so nobody saw a consent prompt for that app ever again, if it's something that they've approved, if IT has approved that thing and wants to keep using it for everybody, I can add this admin consent query parameter here, and now you'll see this extra little bit of info that's letting me know that this app is going to be consented to on behalf of everyone in my organization. Now, this is not something I have to do as an admin, but I can choose to consent for everyone, or I can choose to consent for myself. Now let's see what this looks like. Yes. I'm going to consent to it here. It's going to dump me back to Contoso.com, which dumps me back to Microsoft.com. And then I'm just going to create one more app. And this is going to be my sync daemon. This is going to require some more permissive application permissions that only an admin can consent to. And there it is. Oh, I think I spelled it wrong. Okay. I'll leave that there for now just to be speedy. And let's say I need to read and write directory data in the application context, which is a pretty high privilege permission. But let's say this is running a big sync job across my entire Azure AD. It's necessary. So now I'm going to plug this app ID in, and you'll see. So if I tried to install this app, for lack of a better term, as the non-admin user, I still sign in. Oop, that's not the right. I don't think I saved that permission update. That's strange. There we go. So as you can see, I get an error, and I get told I can't access this app because it requires permission that only an admin can grant, and it prompts me to go find an admin, or if I am an admin, it gives me a switch account button so I can log in and consent to it as an admin. And an admin would be able to consent to this properly. So now I'm going to pass back to Adam, who's going to show you some of the admin controls we have.
That's right. Thanks, Jeff. So I'm actually going to show you one more thing, which I'm going to steal Jeff's app for. If you wanted to grant permissions right here in this UI and not have to do query parameters and things like that, or go to the app, you can actually click that button up there, grant permissions. So if I were to do that as an administrator that I've actually signed into, click that guy, it's going to say, hey, you want to grant this permission? Done. It's another way of doing it. So that was one of those 3 ways that I mentioned in the beginning.
And just one quick note. As Adam just showed you, there's many ways consent can be granted. What you would normally see is that a developer would build all this programmatically into their app. So you'd go out and you would start using a SaaS app or a line of business app, and it would start working with Azure AD and Microsoft Graph, and users would automatically see that consent prompt. You don't always have to go into the portal and manually click buttons or copy and paste query strings. It should just work in line.
And so what we're going to finish off with is the concept of manageability. And this is going to be focused more on the IT administrators in the group. So you'll find some common challenges with consent as administrators. How many of you have used, say the Azure AD portal or some of our identity management experiences, and you saw an app and you're like, what the heck is this app? A mystery app. Raise your hand. Oh yeah. Guess what? A lot of times these can be user-consented applications, like, what's an example of one? A user-consented application off the top of your head. Dropbox, sure, whatever. They come to Dropbox. Dropbox is like, yo, I want to use your blah-bitty-blah from your organization. They're like, all right, cool, done. Well, that's going to create basically a service principal in your organization. It's going to show up in your list. It's a mystery app. Where do they come from? I don't remember signing anyone to this. That's a question one might ask. Another thing you might find is you know about an app, but then there's like a mystery assignment. Like, who that? What? How did Susie get assigned to this? What's going on? I don't remember doing that. Okay. And the last is mystery permissions. It's like, okay, I know about the app, but I have no idea what power it has over my organization. And it looks like, sadly, they removed my my Lord of the Rings reference here. But anyway, good news, these need not be mysteries any longer because I'm going to teach you and show you a few things. So the first is, hey, what happens in the admin view when somebody actually consents to an application? Like, what do I see? How can I see what permissions an application has? How can I see what consented applications are assigned to a user or a group? Did you know that you can do this today? How many of you guys knew that you could do this today? Okay, cool. I'll show you. How can you revoke a consent grant? Important thing. How can you request administrator level consent using portal? I just showed you that. That was the grant permissions button. Yeah? And then finally, how can you actually control from policy perspective how consent actually works in your organization? So let's go through these one by one. So I'm going to go back to the Azure portal. Another pro tip, go to aad.portal.azure.com. You'll see, if you're an identity person, you'll see this is more of a tailored experience for identity than you would get if you just go to portal.azure.com, which has all the other cool Azure stuff. So first things first, I've got Phoebe here. Actually, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Abby because that's the person we just did this demo for. Abby Brecken is an end user in my organization. And it turns out that if I want to see all the applications Abby has access to, I can click on applications from her users view. And I got to this by going to users and groups here. Now, you can see that I've gotten access to a lot of stuff as Abby. And interestingly enough, you can see that this experience, for example, you can just start searching it, right? And you can just see all the different things that Abby has access to. You can do the same for a group. And if you drill into one of these, you can see more information about the assignment. You can see, for example, how they got access to it. You can see information about like what it's actually getting access to. You can even drill into the application itself to learn a little bit more. Now, the interesting thing comes into play when we start talking about consented applications. So I've swapped over here to Timothy Perkins. And Timothy is our handy-dandy admin. I'm just going to reload the applications tile thing here. And Timothy has access to some different applications. But if I go into, for example, SyncDemon, that's the one we just registered, you can see that this is a directly assigned application. And I have the ability to remove access here. Actually, I'm going to go back. And I'm going to pick a different app because I want to show you something else. Identity Insights. This is an example of an application that I've done user consent to. Identity Insights is what we used to call our CIO portal in any case. And as a user consented application, I can actually see what permissions have been granted to this application right here within this view. So take a second. And it'll actually load the different APIs that's calling into and what level of permissions those things actually have. The cool thing about this is that this same experience is available from the application itself. So any application that you have integrated with Azure Active Directory, which uses OpenID Connect and requests permissions, you can actually go into that application and see exactly what it's asking for. I have no idea. Oh, there it goes. I have no idea why it took so long. But in any case, you can drill into each one of these permissions and learn more about what it actually does. So if you hover over all these things, you can see a bunch of information about what this is actually explaining to you. I encourage you to go to these experiences and check them out in your portal. So this is a good way that you can understand who has access to what and what permissions those particular applications have against a particular individual. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to a different application. So I've now switched context. I'm in Enterprise Applications, and I've selected Adam's Fun App. Turns out Adam's Fun App requests a ton of stuff. Okay? And I just wanted to show you that you can see literally all of the permissions that this thing is asking for from the context of the application itself. So if you have an application that you're wondering about what it can do, you want to know what power it has, come here, click on that required permissions navigation item, and you can do the same thing which I showed you previously, which is to drill into each one of them, learn more about them. The other thing is that as people consent to applications in your organization, you're going to see them show up here in the users and groups view for all these applications. So if you're just wondering about, like, hey, where do I just see? You can see it from both the user's perspective and also from the application's perspective. And the last thing I want to show you is how you can control this in your organization, and I want to leave you with something. If you're concerned about users consenting to their own applications, and you want to say, okay, as an administrator, I want to take control over this and only, allow users to use applications when I explicitly consent to them, you can come here and you can turn this off. You can actually say users can consent to apps accessing company data on their behalf. You can turn that off. We do not recommend you do this. This is like the 800-pound gorilla type of an approach, and you are going to cause potential problems for your organization as a result, because you're going to really close the door in terms of that viral application adoption. And I'll leave you with a tidbit before we close about that. You do have another option, though. If you want to, for example, if you have a specific app and you want to say, okay, this particular app, I don't really want much to happen with it, I don't want people to be able to consent to it, you can go to the application itself. Okay, I'm going to go back to Adam's Fun Application. You can go to Properties, and you can actually turn this to no. You can say enable for users to sign in. You can just turn that off. So you can disable that application for sign-in. And there's another option which allows you to actually enforce user assignment for certain applications, and you can turn that to on, which would require there to be an explicit user assignment created in order for users to access that application. So those are kind of your three options. Thank you for zooming it. I would recommend that you don't do the first one, because that's really going to close a lot of the doors. We do understand why it's necessary at some point. And what I'll leave you with is one of the things that Jeff and I are partnering on is some improvements to this experience in terms of what granularity you can execute some of these policies against your organization in. We're also working on some better views in terms of understanding more about how permissions are working in your organization, so you can get some better insights there. These are all things that we're invested in building. And so over time, you're going to see some more controls be put in place in here, so you can have an even better IT admin experience with Azure Active Directory. Anything else you want to add, Jeff? Thank you so much for spending 27 minutes with us. We do have 3 minutes for questions. I know we have got some people here who are going to start another session. Are there any quick questions that we can answer in the front? Say that one more time. Alerting on permission changes.
So you're asking if an app has been granted some permissions, is granted more, you're wondering.
Yes. So the question is, so when a permission is actually granted, I believe that shows up in the audit log. In fact, I know it does. So you could subscribe to that and pull it into your SIEM tool and get alerts that way. In terms of, is that a scenario that we're looking at? I would say we don't have an explicit roadmap item for that right now. I will say that we have thought about it. Yeah. Thank you for that question, sir. How do you find out who? The question is, how do you find out who actually registered the application? The way that you can do that is through our audit view. So if you go to Control 0.
While he pulls that up, in the data model itself, when a non-admin user registers an app, there will be an owner link created between the app and the person who created it. When an admin creates it, you don't get that link. But either way, it should show up in the audit log. But you could also, for example, use a graph query to query that owner link.
So it hasn't quite slurped through our system yet. You could drill into the service principal creation, and there should be a creator associated with that you can backtrack to. So yeah. Other questions, sir? Ooh. That is a fascinating question. So we have a solution. I don't know the explicit answer to that question. However, we have something called Azure AD Domain Services, and Azure AD Domain Services exposes an LDAP front end to Azure AD, including some group policy capabilities. Now, what the crossover point between our OpenID Connect story and that is, I'm not sure. So I can't really explicitly answer your question. I would be happy to follow up with you if you'd like. Other questions? Sir? Oh, wonderful. You played right into our hands.
I'm glad you asked.
The question is there any plan on the roadmap to allow for whitelisting and blacklisting applications? Jeff, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we don't have a concrete date for that yet, but it is something that we definitely want to do. So what we want to do is take that switch that today is users can consent to apps, users can't consent to apps, that 800-pound hammer that Adam described. We want to break that down into a bunch of little toggles that basically emulate how an IT admin would review an app when it came to their desk if a user wasn't able to consent to it. So we want to add a whitelist and blacklist. We want to add attribute-based whitelisting. So basically, users can consent to apps unless they ask for these 5 permissions. Users can consent to apps that come from these 5 publishers. Users can't consent to apps if they have a risk score greater than X or something like that. So yes. We'll go here first.
Yeah, so if you have an app and you want to register,
Mm-hmm.
like for example, like mail out or iOS 11,
Mm-hmm.
actually use this app consent to actually use. If you have used that consent off, how do you go in and add the app if it's not contact the vendor?
So the question was, if I have a native application running on, say, iOS, like the iOS mail application, and it is not exposing a web front end, then how do I perform user consent operations using OpenID Connect and the Azure AD application platform? Is that right? Okay. I think I know the answer to that. Jeff, you are the developer expert, so you probably know the answer better than I, but you or me, who do you want?
You go.
Okay, let's see if I get it right. I think the answer is that application would use our Active Directory authentication library, which would allow you to expose effectively a web, even though it's not a web app, it would allow you to expose a web front end. For example, if you've ever used Outlook, you've probably used Outlook. If you using the newer versions, when you actually sign in that thing, it pops up a thing that looks very much like a web portal-y thing, right? That's ADL, Active Directory Authentication Library. You can do that same type of experience from any application, is my understanding. However, Jeff?
Yeah, but you wouldn't need to necessarily even do that. So first, let's say it's the iOS mail app, the native one, not Outlook. Apple, in an ideal world, there's several ways you could achieve this, but in an ideal world, Apple would register that app with Microsoft as a multi-tenant app and make it available to Azure AD and Office 365 customers. And then they could do 2 things. They could make it just do user consent, in which case, or ask for user consent all the time, in which case it would fail unless you were an admin if you would turn consent off. Or they could also add a separate button somewhere in their admin setup, if they have one, that says, if you're an admin, click here. And at that point, they could prompt for admin consent. If they do that, then you'll just come across that as you're doing some sort of admin configuration for that app in your organization, and you'll be asked to consent on behalf of everyone in the organization. If they don't do that, all hope is not lost. You can use the query string parameter that I showed earlier. You add the query string that's prompt equals admin underscore consent. what that'll do, and basically what you do is you
Zero white.
act as if you're going to sign into the app as a user.
Whiteboard pen.
Grab the
Whiteboard
URL it redirects you to our authorized endpoint, tack on that query parameter, and we have documentation for this. You don't have to memorize it. And long story short, that will ask you as an admin if you want to consent to the app on behalf of everyone in the organization, even if Apple didn't go through the steps to add an explicit admin consent button. So yeah, you can do it.
Yeah, that is here. So prompt equals admin underscore consent. So pass that as a query string parameter to the login page.
So this question was if you have a service account that's running in the background and you want to have that accessing data without any user prompts. So what you would do there is you would use application permissions, which are the type of permissions that are not on behalf of the signed in user. So you're calling the API as the application, not as the application plus the signed in user. And you would need an admin to consent to that app running, because that is a pretty high privilege thing to do, but it's totally possible in our app model. Anything else? Okay.
That's these here.
Yeah, we have plenty of sample apps. What I would recommend is check out graph.microsoft.com. And if you look at documentation and samples, the consent stuff we talked about today is applicable to many APIs, not just Microsoft Graph. But if you go to graph.microsoft.com, samples and SDKs, and you can choose your language of choice, or we have REST samples. And then you want to look for something that says daemon or S2S or application permissions. But we definitely have samples for that.
Any other questions? Was this a useful session? You learned something?
All right.
All right. Thank you so much
for joining us.
hanging out with us. Appreciate it.